It now gives me great pleasure to introduce the first keynote speaker of the day, David Tusa. David's a partner with Booz & Company and a member of the firm's communications, media and technology practice. He's got over 18 years' experience in operations, consultancy and finance in mobile communications and satellite operating companies. After establishing one of the first MVNOs, for those who don't know it, that's a mobile virtual network operator, in the Netherlands, he joined Booz & Company in 2000, moving from London to Tokyo and then to Dubai. And his work centers on mobile operating company performance improvement and satellite program development. Thank you very much indeed.
Dean, ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure to be here this morning. It's a great honor for Booz & Company to be associated with such a fantastic event. It's a great honor for Booz & Company to have been associated for many years with London Business School. We have enjoyed a long and, I hope, mutually fruitful relationship between our two organizations when, on many occasions, we've welcomed LBS graduates into the firm and likewise sent many of our colleagues to this fantastic institution. Speaking of institutions, the Middle East Club is obviously a very important part of the LBS, and it's a particular pleasure and a great honor for me to be addressing you today in this subject. There are many things that we need to say about this particularly complicated and difficult discussion. From my perspective, I've been living in Dubai now for about 5 years. I came to Dubai from Japan, where I also lived there for about 5 years, and have a long history in Booz & Company and helping companies succeed and grow and develop in the context of the economies within which they perform. And this is the backdrop for this discussion today, is about staying on the road to growth. We've subtitled this way, Middle East leaders must maintain their commitment to economic reform. There's a couple of points, particularly in this subject, in the title of this discussion. Staying on the road to growth doesn't say that we need to divert from the course. It means that the complication and the challenge that we face right now at all levels of economic development is staying committed to growth. We have seen fantastic growth in the region in the past 10, 15, 20 years. Absolutely astonishing. And I've been coming to Dubai for about now 10 years and have seen with my own eyes the extraordinary growth that committed leadership and visionary leadership can create. Likewise in other parts of the Gulf, in Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Bahrain, so on and so on. And also more broadly in the region, so thinking about India, Pakistan, bits of North Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, and how the region has catalyzed growth across a very broad stage. So the subject of my discussion today talks about what we need to do to keep on this path to growth, what we need to do at policy level, what we need to do at company level, how companies and policies and governments need to interact, need to move forwards with their discussions. We start the discussion about a fundamental set of economics, because after all, growth is really just about economics. We look at GDP, typically, to say, where are we? We're talking about continuing the path to growth, and what we've seen in the past 10 years is fantastic economic expansion. Even in the past year, we've seen the pace of economic expansion move forwards very substantially. Across all the markets, clearly, the impact of hydrocarbon wealth is undeniable. What we've seen is this growth pushing forwards and pushing further downwards in the economies to keep growth moving forwards. We're now at a point where in MENA, nominal GDP is about $3 trillion. This is a fantastic number. Our GDP growth on an annualized basis is about 9%. Contrast this with world growth of 1.8%. Contrast this sadly with European growth and the UK growth, and we put this in a context of terrific and important forward momentum. We now have about 390 million people, and this is where we start to talk about the challenge. One of MENA's issues is a fundamentally demographic one. Of the 390 million people, roughly 120 million people are under the age of 15. Even those from 15 to 24 is a very, very substantial number. And what we're seeing here is a very interesting demographic bubble. The impact of this is as the economies move forwards and as we grow and as we transform these economies into really sustainable, growing economies, the reason we're doing this is to create an economic environment which is suitable for these 118, 120 million people. Now, population growth in MENA is considerably faster than the rest of the world, roughly 2% odd. Now, coming from Japan, where actually population is shrinking, where you have exactly the inverse effect, where the bubble is now in the 50s and 60-year-olds, which creates a completely different set of problems. They're no less important, they're no less pertinent. But the point we're facing in MENA is a different challenge, but with the same landscape. So fundamentally, an economic issue. The challenge that we face as a business community, and I'm saying a business community in the context of a policy discussion, is really one of unemployment. It's about unemployment and, to a certain extent, underemployment, but I'll come on to that in a few minutes. Total unemployment in the MENA region right now is roughly around 10%. This is relatively high next to the rest of the world. World, about 6%, Sub-Saharan Africa, about 8%, Central Eastern Europe, not having a particularly good time at the moment, roughly 9%. But I think the story lies on the vertical axis, not on the horizontal. Youth unemployment of 25% is our biggest single challenge. The biggest single challenge we face, and I say we face, is to drive a sustainable discussion for this 25%, to bring it down to a level which will continue to move the economy forwards. Now, we talked about the path to growth, and we talked about continuing the path to growth. One of the products, if you like, of the path to growth has been this fantastic rise in tertiary education. We've seen over the past 10 years an extraordinary 5% CAGR, up to about 7 or 8% in some countries, growth in the number of tertiary graduates. This is nothing short of amazing. It's quite fantastic in terms of the development of an educational infrastructure, of schooling systems, of the extent to which people have been ignited by the opportunities of education. But again, the story lies over here. The story's on the demand side. The story's on where the jobs are coming from. It's fine to create a graduate, but creating a graduate who can't find a job is very dispiriting. It's very uncomfortable. The challenge here is that graduates are not being absorbed by the workforce. You saw in the previous slide the need to create jobs, about 75 million jobs. 75 fulfilling, meaningful, paying jobs need to be created in the MENA region to soak up the potential which the region has. So employment rates are relatively low, and this is one of our fundamental challenges. Understandably, in this context, graduates look towards the public sector. Booz & Company's done some research very recently. We'll be publishing this quite soon, which is called The Student Voice in the GCC. We ask students, what do you want to be when you grow up? What do you want to be when you graduate? Where do you want to go? Where do you want to be part of the economy? We were very surprised by the answers. 11% said own business. We want to develop our own business. We want to become entrepreneurs. We feel the energy and the excitement. 32% said international private companies. A third said they wanted to join companies who are active in the region but not of the region. 11% local private companies, roughly the same as own businesses. What we were very surprised about was 34% want to go into the public sector. Now, this is great. This is fantastic because an important public sector, a stable public sector, is absolutely the underpinning for what economic growth needs to create. But there are hidden challenges in that. 4% to charity and 8% don't know. Frankly, it's pretty amazing that people have the view and the perspective of where they want to be. But the message here is really in the bottom part of this slide. A third want to go into the public sector, 32% want to go into international private companies, and 11% into local private companies. So this really says something about how people feel, what they're worried about. The role of the public sector as a means to alleviate some of the fears of MENA's employable youths. The fears are about the high cost of living. The fears are about finding a job on graduation. The fears are about unemployment. These are real fears. These are real fears that people feel absolutely at their heart when they're working very hard to get a really decent education. This is very relevant for this community here. When they're working hard to get better, to improve themselves, to prove to a future workforce that they can make a strong contribution, but they're still worried about the cost of living. So in this sense, when we talk about sustainable growth, we're talking about alleviating these fears, and we're talking about creating a substructure between a partnership between, let's say, the public sector leadership and between private sector employment to alleviate these fears and create a sustainable economy for the future. So against this backdrop, of course, clearly the Arab Spring was enormously exciting. It was an incredibly exciting event, and much has been discussed about this, but where we are now, a while onwards, encapsulates the challenges ahead. We see 5 systemic tensions. And how we're putting these tensions together is we say, well, look, let's look around the landscape. Let's look at the relationship between public and private, between youth as they develop, between policy, between action, between economic development. And let's try and resolve some of the issues that we're facing. The first one is stability versus openness. This is about dialogue. This is about the dialogue between a government and its people. The second tension, appeasement and transformation. This is a discussion about economic policy, or rather the beginning of the discussion about economic policy. The third one, nationalization versus privatization. As companies evolve, as economies evolve, this is one of the areas that we see. The fourth one, exclusion and inclusion. Large parts of the workforce are currently excluded from the economy. What can be done about that? And lastly, sovereignty and regionalization, the broader discussion about regional power. Now, as we sit in Europe, regionalization is giving us lessons every day about the evolution of regionalization. And frankly, as a European, I find this fantastic to watch, but I'm in many ways happy to watch it from the outside. So I want to discuss one by one these trends. We're comparing here in these 5 trends where we were before the Arab Spring and the challenges that we have going forwards. So when we talk about listening and responding to people, stability versus openness, in the past we had a cautious attitude that economic reform might lead to instability. I think that we've moved forwards from this. I think we've conclusively discussed that this isn't the case, that economic reform in many cases creates stability, which we've seen. What we see now is that we've seen an emergence of soft power. Some governments in the GCC are using soft power to create a level of stability which wasn't there before. So we've seen investments in universities. The London Business School's presence in the UAE is a testament to that. Many other leading universities are participating directly in the GCC. We've seen top television stations, top communications companies. The Dean was talking about Yahsat, Jassim's company. It's a fantastic example of a very high technology, of a very specific investment, which is being led from the region. Going forwards, we see a discussion about civic engagement. We see a dialogue which needs to be built between governmental leadership and the people. Now, in the middle of this is the business community. And we see very much one of these tensions that needs to be resolved as we go forwards being that of stability versus openness. Appeasement versus transformation. This is a particularly thorny issue. The idea is that, yes, of course, using subsidies, you can, you can shore up a particular economic discussion. But the more that you shore up the discussion, the more costly and the more painful the end transformation is going to be. So when a government chooses to invest, or rather not invest, but chooses to subsidize a specific industry, it's simply putting off the pain. What we see is the need to face up to this, the need to face up to leading the transformation, leading a discussion which says we need to transform industries. We must take the necessary steps to remove subsidies. The Egyptian subsidy story is just one example. And only by changing subsidies, only by walking away from this discussion and accepting that we need to go through economic pain and transformation, will we then be able to move forwards. Public-private sector balance is a very specific challenge. as more people go into the public sector, the greater is the risk of disconnect between the public sector and the private sector. I talk to a lot of SMEs, a lot of small businesses in the UAE, and what we've seen very often is that we've seen a growing disconnect, a growing challenge between, let's say, government policies and how small businesses are emerging. It may be that there's a case that over time we need to redress this balance. We need to see a situation in which governments can foster very actively small businesses, that they can very actively build small businesses, medium-sized enterprises. This is where historically economic growth is going to come from, and this is where in the future the dynamism, the innovation, the excitement in the economies is going to come from. We see this across the region, is that what we need is a continuous movement towards privatization, towards the growth of private enterprise. Inclusive policies, we've seen dramatic shifts here, but there's more needs to be done. We have fundamental demographic issues. We have an economy which has certain requirements. Fundamentally, what we need to see is policies which create the need for a middle class. The growth of the middle class is that which will propel us through the next 10, 15 years. The involvement of women, the participation of women in the economy, represents a tremendous, tremendous opportunity. Again, Booz & Company has published some research called The Other 3 Billion, which talked about the role of women in the economy, the role of women in economic development. Some governments in the GCC have done fantastically well on this. Others have moved forwards, for sure, but yet still we believe more needs to be done. Again, it's a complicated story, as all of these discussions are complicated, and we've realized that it's never as easy to make these things happen rather than to stand in front of you and talk about them. But nevertheless, we see this discussion as being one of the engines of future economic growth. The last of our tensions is about regionalization. So there are two trade blocs which now still function, the Greater Arab Free Trade Area and the GCC, both of which have made a fantastic contribution to growing the economies and creating integration of the economies. Our message here and our discussion here is that these efforts must be continued. The integration is rather integrating, not integrated. But we've seen that integrated economies can themselves spur growth, can themselves create forward momentum. This is vitally important. To summarize, the long-term course of economic reform is very much a journey. It's not a destination. There is an understandable temptation to say, look, let's put a sticking plaster, let's put a Band-Aid here, let's ignore the long-term consequences. This is what we very, very firmly believe must not happen. The youth, the young audience, the young population is that which will have to take advantage of the economic policies which we put in place. There are millions of young women ready to enter the workforce, eager to enter the workforce, with fantastic energy and excitement and a sense of innovation. Global companies are very keen to participate in the Gulf. We've seen this in the past 10 years. This is only the future, and this also represents a very important part of the partnership between private and public sectors. So our message here is really this is about staying the course. This is about stable policies. It's about consistent policies which create together a fundamental foundation for sustainable economic growth. So ladies and gentlemen, thank you for the opportunity. Happy to take any questions that there may be.
Talking, yes. Seems to me one of the big challenges is at what level we bring the young people into the Middle East workforce. As being a past employer there may be an aspiration perhaps to come in at too high a level. To me, that is the big challenge. At what level do we get them to come into the workforce?
Let me answer that with some direct experience of this. My first answer to that is I don't think it can ever be too early. Now, if this happens at graduation, before graduation, after graduation, a system of apprenticeships, a system of summer internships, I think these mechanisms exist already. I think what we need to see, frankly, is that they're expanded, is that we see more of them. And the breadth of where summer internships happen are not just, for example, in consulting firms or lawyers or whatever, but they're really in industrial companies. So in the small and medium enterprises that actually do stuff. Now I contrast my job, which is talking about stuff, to actually people who are doing things. I think if we do this, then you'll see people who become much more excited by the opportunities created by, let's say, industry, by trade, by some of the very interesting part of the economies which is very unique to the region. Going on from that, look, it's a complicated discussion, this one. How do you create really the structure for including, let's say, more locals, more nationals in the workforce? There are various different ways of doing this. Various different regions have approached this in different ways, some very successfully, some less successfully. Systems of quotas are typically used. These are complicated. They create unintended consequences. They create problems of their own. But in long answer to a short question, my very firm belief is that the sooner you get people involved in seeing how business works, the better this will be in the longer term.
Sorry, can I just come back? Yeah, but the youth don't always want to come in at that low level. They sort of want to jump in at too high a level, I think, is the problem.
For sure. I mean, this is, that particular point is one of long-term discussion about participation, about understanding the role of business, about understanding that business is not about jumping in, and you can't simply jump in at a level. You have to learn it. It's a craft. It's a craft like anything else. Now, this can only start as early as possible. Thank you for that question. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
Ayman Adher, Global IMC. I guess the question now is not policies per se. A lot of government understand what needs to be done. It's the political will to do it, because there is a lot of shifting sands in the political landscape in Egypt, for example. And you mentioned subsidies. We know that there is a need for a clear policy to address subsidies issues, but the politics is preventing these right policies to be in place. So a few years ago, everybody would say it's economics, stupid, but now it's political, it's politics, stupid. It's one area. The second is there are pockets in the Middle East, in the economy, that does not require reinventing the wheel and capitalizing on what's already been built. And I want to mention only one area which I'm very familiar with and I worked in very much, is outsourcing industry. Egypt, Jordan, Tunisia, Morocco, these are pioneering countries and ranked very, very high in outsourcing. And what is the raw material of outsourcing? Is the 118 million people that you mentioned there. So it doesn't really need a rocket scientist to say, all right, here what we have, we already invested billions of dollars to put these countries on the map of outsourcing, global outsourcing, which is $4 trillion industry. That doesn't require the sophisticated workforce, because there is huge spectrum in outsourcing where we can use different skill sets, which ties again to the education level and so on. So there are really major or clear pathway to go forward, but it's politics. And that's the challenge. Thank you.
Absolutely. Look, thank you for that. You raise a very important point, and this is really again, the balance between, let's say, the political reality and the economic reality. I think on the question of subsidies, it's undeniable that, like I said, it's easy to stand here and say, remove subsidies, go ahead. This is clearly impractical. But what can be done, and look at the success of education, what can be done is that policies can be put in place which can start to take people down this journey. It's not as if this has never happened. There are precedents. There are ways to do it. I agree very much in a time of political turmoil, and in stability, it takes enormous confidence and incredible leadership. And maybe we're not quite there yet in some of the more, let's say, countries that have been affected by the Arab Spring. This will take time, for sure. And this kind of discussion doesn't happen overnight. It doesn't change overnight, absolutely. On to your other point about, are there sectors, either industry sectors or functional sectors, which certainly can be boosted? Yes, very much so. Very, very much so. Outsourcing is one of them. We've seen it, you're absolutely right, and there are very good examples of where Egypt and Jordan and so on have really stepped into the fray. The infrastructure exists, the submarine cables exist, the telecommunications network exists to make this possible. So there's no reason why there shouldn't be, these areas shouldn't be pushed very strongly. Some great opportunities. Yes, sir, question over there.
Good morning. Thank you for the excellent presentation. This is Firas Chakra from Lancer Capital. You mentioned 32% that 32% of the youth are targeting jobs with governments. I don't know whether that's what you think of that. Does that compare? Is that higher than the average UK student, if you will, or is that much lower? And as you mentioned, in the MENA region, governments have very disparate achievements in terms of what they do with their graduates. For me, in some of these countries, 32% is actually very worrying because some of these governments are just, as you know, employment agencies. So if you want to sort of expand on that, that'd be great. Thank you.
Yeah. I think this is one of the fundamental challenges, and where graduates want to, where they see themselves and where they see themselves participating is one of the very kind of telling and issues that we face. I think there are several ways out of this. One, of course, is fundamentally education. And back to your question earlier on, how do you make people excited by business? I mean, clearly we are all in this room excited by business. This is the concept, the context within which we're having this discussion. But how do you make people excited by that? There was a time when I was going to be a professional musician, but I ended up being a management consultant. Now, what happened with that? When some people say, well, maybe I should have been a professional musician. Maybe I'll go back to this at some point in the future. But I became very excited by business, by enterprise, by making stuff, by making things happen, by the creation of value, by the creation of growth. Now, yes, we can talk about that in the context of education. Yes, we can talk about it in the context of public policy. But fundamentally, the generation of people who are growing up, who will be leading the economies as we move forwards, have to become excited by business. I don't have the answer to that. But over time, talking to kids when they're at school, talking to people in their undergraduate years, helping them see access to business, I think this is the only way that we can get out of it. It will take time, but we need to make it a really exciting journey for people. Really exciting. Yes, sir.
Thanks. Just on your last point, speaking to friends and colleagues across the region, the one thing that we haven't really mentioned here is wasta and corruption. And amongst the people I'm speaking to, that is generally what stops them being excited about business. The inability to effect that change purely based on merit.
Tricky one. A lot of dimensions to this question, some of which are very sensitive, some of which don't honestly really belong in this room. I think, let me try and answer this question from a different perspective, which is about investor confidence. Now, if I had $50 million to invest, if I wanted exposure to a particular sector, if I was looking at exposure to a particular geography, let's say the Middle East, I was excited by the pivotal role of this region in terms of trade. My question as an investor is, how would I make that evaluation? What would I worry about? I would worry about the rule of law. I would worry about fundamental economic, let's say, relationship between law and doing business. This is the first thing. And in many parts of this region, this is already a given. It's done. And fantastic progress has been made for that. The second one I would worry about is the financial system. There was a comment from the Dean, I think, about the implementation of financial rules, of financial reporting standards, for example, across the region. This is happening. That creates the basis, the fundamental basis for where I feel comfortable with putting my money. The educated workforce, this is much of the subject of our discussion. That I would be a little bit less confident about, maybe. I think your question about corruption, I would need very carefully to evaluate my appetite for risk. Corruption is a discussion about inconfidence. It's a lack of confidence. You don't know exactly where the rules are and how it works. Now, in the past 5 years, I've worked all over from Afghanistan, Pakistan, all the way to West Africa, and this issue exists. From an investor perspective, what it does is to reduce the level of confidence you have about putting money in the right place. The opportunity from a geographic perspective is that those geographies who can show terrific progress, a sense that they will beat it, that they will remove corruption, these will be the winners. These will be the areas in which foreign direct investment will be absolutely prioritized. And we can see this already across the region. I'm not going to say which countries are good and which are bad, but it's a very, very good point. And I think from an investor confidence perspective, it's a decision as an investor that you need to make. Yes, sir.
From a Western company perspective in the Middle East, I've heard from one director who runs the operation of that company in Dubai saying that they tend not to hire locals because it's a very tribal region. So if you hire someone from one tribe, then it might not be able to sell to a different tribe. So the two questions here. One, is this true from a Western perspective? Second is this really a tribal region? Is this the right way to think of partners where you want to actually grow the economy for?
Yeah. Look, it's a very pertinent question. I think simply not engaging with locals is not the answer. I can see some companies who will choose to go down this path, and I have two perspectives on that. Firstly, I don't think it's actually fair from an economic perspective. I don't think you're doing the right thing. If you, as a company, are participating in the economy, you have to participate in the economy. If this means engaging with local population, if this means hiring locals, this is what it means and this is what it takes. And companies have a moral responsibility to do this, I think. Now, how you do that and over which time you do it and the level to which you really make that practically work is quite challenging. Let's be honest. It's difficult, but shirking from that responsibility, from my view, is not acceptable. Now, does this mean that you have to put in place policies which make this work? I think in some cases those policies don't necessarily produce the outcomes that they require. I think it's back to a broader discussion about education. It's back to a broader discussion about making people want to participate in the workforce. There has to be a meeting of both sides on this one. Undeniably, it's a challenge, absolutely. But it is also the responsibility for companies who participate in the economy to truly participate in the economy in every sense of the word. Yes, sir.
I think in the region, business community and government have been playing Tom and Jerry regarding the employment of the locals.
Yeah.
Especially in Saudi Arabia.
Mm.
Business community has been trying to avoid employing locals. But on the other hand, the standard of expatriates that is coming to the region is declining every year. We're not getting the same quality as before. And this issue is becoming very serious. For any expanding business or a new business, the most challenging point is to find qualified people to work. This is number one. Number two, there's a myth in the region that industry is a very good employer, manufacturing industry. Well, actually it's not. With the new technology, you don't need so much big workforce in factories. If you talk about labor-intensive industry, the region is not competitive in this at all. Industry in the long term, I think, is not an employment generator in the region. We need to look at service industry, being it financial, hospitality, whatever. That will employ a larger number of people, but that needs preparing more and more locals for that.
So your view as a business leader in Saudi Arabia is to more rebalance the economy, or, I mean, which policies would you like to see? How would you like to see, let's say, a government respond to this challenge?
I think they need to introduce new legislations to make the two sides at par, the employer and the employee. It's very important because at the moment there is an imbalance in this relationship. You need to prepare people for employment. So when you're choosing a local or expatriates, the two should be at the same level.
Yeah.
That's very important. And the third one is for the government to have more transparency in terms of the market of employment. They need to publish figures. How many people are actually unemployed? What are the sectors that needs to be addressed? Because we all have only like total numbers. We don't have any specific numbers about sectors that needs to be addressed.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for that.
Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, I think we're probably out of time. Thank you very much for these questions. And thank you again for the opportunity to be part of this dialogue and this discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, David. I don't know how you read my mind, but I was standing right behind you thinking this is the last question. But thank you so much. I really identified a lot with your comments with regards to creating excitement amongst young people to do business and to go out there. My elder sister is actually a fashion designer, a Pakistani fashion designer, and she struggles really hard with issues around corruption and a trained workforce to get her products out into the Gulf and into the greater Middle East region. But yet seeing her spirit to go ahead and pursue opportunities is incredibly motivating to me, and for her to maintain that excitement amongst the difficulties that she faces in the environment are exactly what you alluded to.